some defeats in enclaves of leftism. Big city mayors, big blue city mayors, still have only one explanation for what happened on Tuesday. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott, the other Brandon. We have one, Baltimore has the other. Ironically, they're presiding over two of the cities with the highest murder per capita rate in the country. Baltimore, Chicago, most number of murders in the aggregate. Baltimore right there with New Orleans, Memphis in terms of highest murder per capita in the country. But Brandon Scott knows what happened in this election.
It is really on my heart this morning to say that as a man, but more importantly as a black man, that this country does not deserve black women or black people, but specifically black women. This morning I woke up and I just gave my wife a hug because I know how heavy this is weighing on black women. And they have carried this country and saved this country too many times and continue to be the most disrespected human beings on the planet. And it, quite frankly, it disgusts me. This country is still steeped in racism, sexism, and misogyny.
That's it. Racism, sexism, and misogyny. San Francisco voters are racist, sexist, and misogynist. That's right. Why they de-elected London Breed in favor of that billionaire sign of the Levi Strauss family. That's why London Breed lost in San Francisco. That's why George Gascon lost in L.A. because L.A. voters are racist, sexist, and misogynist. Okay. Not the only one. I mean, this is what this is the main thing that is coming through with those that have platforms. BLM Brandon here in Chicago plays the same card.
Oh, we know.
And, of course, the academics that serve as the ready-to-go pundits on platforms like MSNBC, like Princeton professor. Those who graduate from Princeton, the value of your degree is about to go down when you hear from Eddie Glaude, who's a regular.
There's this sense, right, that whiteness, right, is under threat. The demographic shifts. The country isn't what all of these racially ambiguous children on Cheerios commercials are confusing the hell out of me. I do not believe that. I cannot believe that. And the reason I think you believe it is because you don't want to believe that that's what's really motivating them. It's always the case. People don't want to believe what the country actually is, because if they believe it, they're going to have to confront what's in them. I don't believe that. They voted for a crook, a person who they know is stealing from, just doing everything to undermine the so-called country that they love. And then they're telling us the BS that it's economics. We know that's not true.
No, it's racism, sexism, misogyny, transphobia, and so on and so forth. Okay. All right. That's what you want to go with. That the main reason Trump won is because of the multiracial children in Cheerios ads. Okay. That's a Princeton professor saying that.
That's so sad.
Rafael Mangual is a senior fellow and head of research for the Manhattan Institute's Policing and Public Safety Initiative. He's also the author of Criminal Injustice, What the Push for Mass Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong, and Who It Hurts Most. Rafael, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks always for having me, Dan and Amy.
I mean, I'm not, suggesting that Eddie Glaude and Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott don't have their finger on something. I'm not a criminologist. You are. So, but it seems to me, just reading from the public opinion polling and what people actually said, seems to me pretty clear that it was mainly economics and public safety related that drove this election. But everything that these big cities have, I mean, the only thing they have, so they put everything on it, is the identity hustle.
Yeah, well, I think it's proven to be an effective defense mechanism in years past, and I think people like Brandon Scott see themselves as vulnerable, right? As you mentioned at the top of the segment here. I mean, Brandon Scott has been presiding over one of the deadliest cities in the United States, right? I mean, what's happening on the streets of Baltimore is a national disgrace, and the same goes for Chicago and Brandon Johnson. And so, when you have years of these mayors' tenures and really nothing to show for it in the way of meaningful improvements in public safety. I mean, you can point to a slight homicide decline in Baltimore, but I think that has a lot more to do with just natural fluctuation coming from the fact that you've killed off so much of the population than anything else that he's done. But yeah, when you have that, I think people like that start desperately grasping at straws to maintain their political viability.
And of course, in Chicago, we just had a funeral mass for another cop killed in the line of duty, Enrique Martinez, yesterday. His funeral will be on the 18th at St. Rita's, and that's Enrique Martinez is the 5th Chicago police officer in the last couple years to be gunned down in the line of duty.
Yeah, it really is just incredibly tragic, and seeing some of the security footage and hearing how many times he made that command to stop breaching. I mean, it's gut wrenching. Just one hopes that he didn't die in vain. That this is a wake up call for the city, that they can make different political choices. And one of the most encouraging things about what happened last week is that lots of cities did just that. They started to make different political choices, and public safety was a big motivator for a lot of that. I mean, this isn't to suggest that was necessarily the main reason that Donald Trump won the presidential election, although I do think it's worth pointing out that he enjoyed a 6-point advantage on the public safety question among registered voters in the exit polls. But if you look at the specific state and local contests where public safety was literally on the ballot, you start to see a pretty encouraging trend. I mean, look at the state of California. You mentioned London Breed. You mentioned George Gascon. George Gascon recently, in 2021, survived a recall election. And yet here he lost handedly to Nate Hochman, who ran his campaign for DA on the law and order platform. You mentioned London Breed in the Bay Area, but also across the bridge in Oakland,
Right.
you had the Soros DA Pamela Price successfully recalled. Same thing for Oakland Mayor Sheng Tao, who supported defunding the police. They're both going to be on their way out. And this comes after Chesa Boudin got ousted in San Francisco just a couple of years before that. I mean, you look at other parts of the country as well. You start to see a trend here with the Soros DAs. I mean, in Athens, Georgia, where Laken Riley was murdered by an illegal immigrant, Deborah Gonzalez, who was the Soros DA there, lost her reelection bid. In Phoenix, you got Tamika Wooten, who ran on alternatives to incarceration and restorative justice. She lost to a Republican county attorney, Rachel Mitchell. You had law and order prosecutors win their races in Macomb County, Michigan, just outside of Detroit, in Kenosha County, Wisconsin. Of course, Kenosha being sort of the seat where you had tons and tons of riots. And then, look at some of the ballot initiatives, too. I mean, in Arizona, you had Proposition 311, which proposed new court fees for criminal convictions that are going to go toward first responders. It proposed harsher penalties for assaulting first responders. I mean, astoundingly, you had Prop 312, which actually will now make people eligible for tax refunds when the government fails to enforce laws against illegal camping, loitering, panhandling, public urination, etc. You had Prop 313 in Arizona, which got nearly 2/3 of the vote and puts life sentences on the table for child sex trafficking. And Prop 314 creates new state-level offenses for illegal immigration and fentanyl. You had Prop 36 in California, which sought to kind of roll back Prop 47, which basically legalized petty theft and a lot of drug offenses. In Colorado, you had ballot initiatives like 128 creating a new truth in sentencing regime, 130 directing the legislature to appropriate $350 million for police recruitment and retention. I mean, and I can go on. It really is quite astounding just how much law and order, kind of made a comeback on Tuesday. And the one thing is that you hope is that this is a sign of things to come.
Well, let's talk about Prop 36 in California, because Kamala Harris, the VP, she mailed in her ballot, and when asked about Prop 36, how did you vote on that? She passed on the question.
That's right. That's right. And it's really interesting that she passed on the question, right? Because, at that point, the election hadn't happened yet. And so the question becomes is, who is she trying to court with her silence? Right? It's certainly not, Republicans who are uneasy about Donald Trump. It's certainly not independents who are on the fence about who they want to support. No, she was placating to her progressive base. And, that is just another example of the errors that, she has made throughout her political career. And that's exactly an example of what Americans are fed up with. They want people who are no longer going to stand for things like, pharmacy shelves being emptied by thugs.
But you make this point in your piece over at the City Journal that it wasn't a clean sweep by any stretch, too. I mean, these are always the local dynamics are particular, of particular importance, so they vary locality to locality. But that some places that you would have thought there may have been a similar attitude, sort of these decarceration prosecutors were able to survive at places like border communities like El Paso in Texas, which is a little bit disturbing. So, that this it was progress, as you say, in the direction of law and order, but the battles continue.
That's exactly right. I actually have a follow-up piece that's going to be coming out in City Journal, I think, either today or tomorrow, that looks at the ballot initiative specifically. But it does kind of make the point that, it's surprising that in Houston, El Paso, and Austin, you had these progressive prosecutors survive their reelection bids or win new office. And that, can seem discouraging. But one of the things that I think you can take away from that is if you contrast, those races in which the kind of law and order agenda took a hit with those in which it saw a win, I think the main difference that you'll see is that public disorder is really the kind of problem that can affect political change. Places like El Paso and Houston don't have the same level of sort of skid rowness that LA and San Francisco and Oakland have been dealing with for so much time. They didn't have the massive riots that Kenosha had. They don't have the massive open air drug problems that Colorado has in cities like Denver and Colorado Springs. And so, I think the lesson here is that, public disorder really does matter to voters. And to the extent that, quality of life continues to deteriorate in big American cities, eventually those chickens are going to come home to roost.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that because, of course, that was the way in Chicago. I'm not saying this was right, but, keep the disorder and the skid row qualities to particular neighborhoods, majority minority neighborhoods, I'm saying, really. In this very de facto segregated city of Chicago, keep it out of the downtown revenue producing centers, the entertainment districts, and that if people don't see it, then they won't necessarily feel it, or they're unlikely to. And of course, that has changed under these non-prosecution, decarceration, defund the police politicians, both mayors and prosecutors. And as you say, this is where you jump the shark.
I think that's exactly right. And so, really for cities like Chicago and others where, disorder is becoming a bigger and bigger problem, I think the Progressive Project is on a time clock. And the clock is ticking.
When politicians like the BLM Brandon Scott in Baltimore and BLM Brandon Johnson in Chicago aren't using racial demagoguery, they're going after inanimate objects like certain sport rifles. Federal judge Friday overturning Illinois' ban on some sport rifles. And, of course, the governor here, the mayor, the political class aghast and filing an immediate appeal and so on and so forth. And I'm sure you do, but recalling Trump's first term, there was a push to move legislation that would essentially create reciprocity among the states when it came to right to carry, just as we have reciprocity among the states when it comes to, for example, driver's licenses. And so Chicago and Illinois may be in for a rude awakening in the not-too-distant future about people's right to carry in the city and the state, and the right to own certain sports rifles that are arbitrarily banned. And I hope you can refresh our recollection of just exactly what kind of impact that the so-called assault weapon ban, which is what this is modeled after, from the mid-'90s to the early 2000s, what kind of impact that actually had on violent crime in this country?
Well, I can do that for you in a word, and the impact was essentially nothing. These are initiatives that have been studied time and again, and they have consistently been found wanting as effective crime control measures. I mean, one of the things that the progressives just simply do not want to acknowledge is that the gun violence problem that they, attribute to gun rights in this country is simply not a function of the availability of firearms at the margins. I mean, whether you ban assault weapons, whether you don't, whether you ban high-capacity magazines, whether you don't, that does not seem to have any effect on the relatively small slices of places in this country and small slices of our population that are responsible for the vast majority of our gun offenses. And as I've said time and again, including before the Senate Judiciary Committee when I testified before Congress a year ago, the most effective gun control measure and program that you could ever adopt would be to specifically target the known gang members and high-rate offenders in your given jurisdiction for prosecution for any crime, and seek the harshest penalties that you can possibly get against them. That is your best bet at reducing gun violence in a meaningful way. The idea that you can ban your way out of these offenses is really just silly, and it also underestimates the the necessity for having law enforcement be at the center of that project. I mean, take a guy like BLM Brandon, who has supported defunding the police. Well, who do you think is going to enforce the bans that you're now crying about being overturned? Right?
Rafael,
I mean, how do you discover an illegal firearm? Right? It's through the police.
Right. Rafael Mangual, Senior Fellow, Head of Research for the Manhattan Institute's Policing and Public Safety Initiative, that is. Author of Criminal Injustice, What the Push for Mass Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts Most. Rafael, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks always for having me.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
Hi, everyone. If you or someone you know were diagnosed with lung cancer or mesothelioma, listen up. This could